So, the core problem of tracking in virtual reality is you need the headset and the controllers to be represented, essentially perfectly in 3D space and relay that information to the game. So, with your head, it's very important because you can get motion sickness if you don't have reliable tracking, because your eyes are going, your head's moving one place, but
right.
visually you're not moving in the correct direction. So that's a very critically important part of that. And then you've got your controllers and peripherals, which, if you want to have a reliable interaction, they have to be where you're actually moving them, because your brain, can figure out the difference. You very, roughly know where stuff is. It's the reason why you can, take out your arm, close your eyes, and touch the tip of your nose.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big fancy Greek word for that I can't recall right now. But tracking is hugely important. The way that this is achieved by different platforms is pretty interesting. There's some pretty big differences between some of them, some pretty big similarities. I guess I'll start off with kind of the simplest one, PlayStation VR.
Okay.
So the PlayStation VR tracking has actually remained pretty much the same since before they had PlayStation VR. So, if you remember, the PlayStation Move with the cameras and the LEDs and stuff.
Yeah.
People attach them to guns. People, use them as little wands. It's pretty simple. So it uses inertial tracking and visual tracking.
Okay.
Inertial tracking is good because it's really fast. You'll get updates of data very, very quickly, thousands of times per second. But it's not very reliable. It's not very accurate. So you need to, always intermittently make sure that positional data is corrected by something visual,
right,
which will be absolute. So the way that the PSVR does it is they have this nice, big, glowing ping pong ball sort of thing on the end of it, and the camera just tracks where it is. And they put a lot of effort into making sure that color is not seen in the background and calibrating to that, so it can always find where the actual ball is. Then that is interspersed with much faster inertial data, which is we call them IMUs, an inertial measurement unit, but it's a gyroscope and accelerometer measuring the actual inertial motion as opposed to the absolute position.
And then so, how would you compare sort of the PSVR with the Vive or Oculus? How do those play into that?
Yeah, so the PlayStation VR is definitely on the more primitive end of tracking technologies. You can optimize more and more the technology, but in the end, there's kind of a finite limit to how well it can track. It's always about getting a better camera, getting a better IMU, updating faster, things like that. And in many ways, the Oculus platform is limited by the same things. So okay. Oculus does this really interesting thing. They call it Constellation. It's based on some research done, a couple decades ago, where they have a bunch of infrared LEDs and they all blink very, very quickly, in a synchronous fashion, and they all relay data. And there's much more, it gets more complicated, but that's their visual method. And so they still have an inertial measurement unit, and they use it in the same way that PlayStation does. And everybody uses the inertial measurement unit the same way. It's just about the absolute position.
Okay.
So instead of having that ping pong ball, that, colored thing tracked by a camera, they have these infrared LEDs tracked by a camera. Some of the big benefits there is that human beings, we can't see infrared. So it's kind of obscured from you. You don't, it's not very obvious how the technology works. It's a little sleeker. But if you pull up a camera or something like that, you can actually see it. But yeah, it has the same limitations. You need a better camera. You need faster camera, faster data, things like that. So the technology is more impressive, but at the end of the day, it is also still limited.
Mm-hmm. And so that's PSVR, Oculus, right? Those both use a camera, and they're sort of tracking you in the space using that. So what about sort of lighthouse tracking, which is what I guess the Vive would use?
Yeah. So lighthouse tracking, I can definitely speak on a lot more. As Ilium VR is a licensee of the lighthouse technology.
Right.
So it's pretty interesting. It solves a lot of the limitations that the camera style tracking has, in that a camera can track whatever images, whatever objects that it sees within its frame. But Vive tracking, actually, the objects track themselves, so they figure out their own position and they report it back. So theoretically, you have kind of an unlimited amount of objects that you can track. Whereas with a camera, there's just as many as you can feasibly resolve based on the resolution and the field of view and things like that.
Okay.
So Lighthouse technology, it's called Lighthouse technology because it starts with 2 base stations. They hang on your wall. They kind of work similar to lighthouses in that they have these scanning lasers that rotate and revolve and scan across your room. And those are infrared in the same way that the Oculus technology uses infrared. So it's sleek. You don't really see it. It just tracks you, which is really nice. And those laser lines are sweeping across your room at very specific times, very specific degrees kind of per second. And so your controller, if you ever see a Vive controller or a Vive headset, it's got a bunch of divots on it. And those are all sensors. So they detect when they get hit by the laser lines. And based on the time that it gets hit, you do a bunch of trigonometry and figure out, okay, this is the angle that the laser was at when it swept across. And then after that, you kind of take all of that data and you solve the equation. It's called EPNP. Is the mathematical function that you have to solve to figure out the actual position and rotation. And it's actually the same problem necessary to solve for the Oculus. So at that level, the software level, they're pretty similar, but the hardware and beyond and some of their limitations are very different.
And so, talking further about sort of the constraints with each system, can you talk a little bit about sort of why we chose the Vive?
Yeah, well, I think I would first say that it's a little bit of a misnomer, misattribution to say that we've always supported the Vive. We've supported the Vive, since it existed. But we've existed, our company and our products and prototypes have existed long before the Vive actually came out. And so we actually originally supported Oculus technology.
Okay.
So we have older prototypes that have, constellation-style tracking that we reverse engineered and produced our own solution for. Some of them have completely different style tracking that work as well. So at a certain point, we transitioned to the Vive, which is an important thing to note. So it was, a big portion of that is definitely in the controllers. So, Oculus was the first name in town when it comes to virtual reality for the consumer. So, we started out with their headsets. We started out with their software and their games, but there were no controllers. So we just had to make controllers. We had to make it with whatever technology we could. And we spent, years doing research for that. And once the Vive came out, it already had these controllers immediately with it, which Oculus has their own now, called the Touch, which are really cool. And so those controllers were just a really easy solution to just strap on to the front of our controllers to solve the tracking problem, so that we could focus more on the more important issue when it comes to making an immersive peripheral, which is making the hardware and the experience as immersive as possible. Somebody else has already solved this problem of 3D positional tracking. Oculus solved it, Vive has solved it, PlayStation VR solved it, all in their own ways. So that's not something that we are interested in solving. It's something we're interested in integrating with. So we are always focused on making the most immersive controller possible on those separate platforms.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about this idea of inside-out tracking? I've heard this a lot. I know it has more to do with the player itself, right? Tracking from the controller that they're using rather than around them, trying to see them in the space.
Yeah, so there's two kind of parts to inside-out tracking. Most people, when they refer to inside-out tracking or outside-in tracking, PlayStation VR and Oculus are very obvious examples of outside-in tracking. So they are cameras from the outside looking into your player space and identifying objects. When most people refer to inside-out tracking, they're referring to objects or headsets having cameras on them that look to the outside world. and they figure out, okay, you have a wall here, your wall's probably not going to move. Your couch is probably not going to move. That painting on your wall is probably not going to move. So it detects those images and looks around them. And I know, it can gain a position on that. So we know that Oculus is working on this. We know that Valve actually had some early prototypes for the Steam VR headsets, the Vive style headsets that used cameras and outside-in tracking. They actually used, instead of trying to figure out where your wall is or where your furniture is or something like that, they used what they called fiducials, and they just look like QR codes. So they pretty much had a room slapped around with QR codes, and the camera would figure out, okay, this QR code is here, so that means I'm looking in this direction at this angle. It's an interesting way to solve the problem. When you look at the Vive controllers and Lighthouse technology now, in a way it's similar. It's kind of an outside-in problem in that the device tracks itself. An inside-out problem or type solution where, in inside-out camera tracking, you have the object with a camera figuring out where it is in the space. And the Vive controllers and the headset are the same way, in that they are not told where they are, they figure out where they are and report that. And so inside-out tracking, both Lighthouse style and this camera style, give a really good opportunity for kind of an infinite play space almost, and an infinite number of interactions and hardware and other things like that. It removes a lot of the limitations.
So, I mean, how close are we to sort of having that available to consumers,
Yeah. It's definitely a hard problem. It's a very hard problem to solve, to the point that, Oculus has been heavily hiring machine vision programmers for,
Really?
a year now, or a couple of years now, to try and get as many as possible to solve the problem. Actually, I remember when I was at Oculus Connect, and John Carmack was talking, and he was viewing people's demos and stuff, and somebody came up and they had a machine vision, computer vision type application, and he pretty much offered them an interview on the spot. So that's how heavily they're investing into that sort of technology, and it's a hard problem to solve. People have already done a lot of research into it. There's technologies called SLAM, which I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's used for inside-out style tracking. So in terms of a timeline, I couldn't put a really good guess to it because it's not something that we're actively working on. I know that Oculus is putting a lot of effort into it, and I'm sure that many other research institutions and companies are trying it out as well, because it's a good solution to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an exciting sort of avenue to research. And I know we can really get into the weeds here with a lot of this, the tech stuff.
Definitely, yeah.
But I guess just to finish up, if someone were to come to you and say, I have no VR headset, but I really want to get into it, what are sort of the things you look for in a consumer there of what headsets would work best for them, what their needs are, whether they're playing shooter games, they're doing more discovery experiences. What are your thoughts on that?
You mean from a perspective of a consumer purchasing?
Right.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of different ends of the spectrum here. And I would, first ask a lot of questions of what they're trying to do. So if they're just trying to dip their toes into virtual reality and see what the experience is like, go get a Google Cardboard, get a Daydream if you have a Pixel phone or a supported phone like that. Mobile virtual reality is a great way to just experience VR, at its base level and see what the regular, experience, the basic experience of it is. If they have already tried that and they're, hungry for more, it's a question of price point. When you look at virtual reality, or PlayStation VR rather, their price point is much lower than the Oculus or the Vive.
It's around $600, right? I mean, total cost.
Something like that, I believe. And a lot of people already have the new version of the PlayStation 4 that all you have to buy is the headset for it. So that's a really good way to get a lot of people into it. And, many regular consumers already trust PlayStation. They know PlayStation's been making good consoles for
They've
years.
Got content too.
Exactly. They have all of those things built out already. If you're looking for something more along the lines of the bleeding edge of virtual reality, or the cutting edge of virtual reality, Oculus or Vive are both really good platforms. In the long term, Vive is probably going to have a lot more hardware experiences like the ones that we're developing because of how open and free they're being with their hardware and the Lighthouse platform. But Oculus is investing, $500 million into game development. So there's a lot of more content, more polished content that'll be there in the near future. So it really depends on what they're looking for, and what they're trying to purchase and what experiences they're trying to capture and have.